"She will sign," they said, and not one soul in that saloon knew the quiet man sitting in the corner would cost Denton Hale everything he had spent 12 years building. That is the kind of story this is. It happened in early autumn 1887 in the town of Calder's Bluff, New Mexico territory. A young widow named Clara Voss was pulled through the front doors of the Silver Ace Saloon by 3 men in the employ of the man who owned it, pulled the full length of the room past every man at every table, and those men did nothing but watch. Some of them laughed. Nobody looked at the corner table. Nobody noticed the glass come down onto the table without sound. Nobody noticed the chair ease back. Nobody noticed the quiet man in the gray coat rise to his feet with the specific, unhurried stillness of a man who has already decided everything and is simply moving through the steps in order. They did not know who he was yet. The name would come. Names like his always did. Before we go any further, I want you to subscribe to this channel and drop the name of someone who once stood up for you when nobody else would. Just the name. Nothing else needed. I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning of that Wednesday, before the doors opened and before Clara Voss crossed that floor. Because a story like this one does not start in the middle of a room. It starts much further back than that. My name is not important. What is important is that I was in Calder's Bluff that autumn, and I saw what happened, and I have been carrying it inside me for long enough that it is time it was told. So pull up a chair, partner. This one is worth the hearing. Calder's Bluff sat in a valley between 2 red rock ridges in the southeastern corner of New Mexico territory, the kind of town that had been built fast and wrong the way towns in the territory tended to get built, with a main street wide enough for 3 wagons abreast, and buildings on either side that leaned into each other, like men holding each other up at the end of a hard week. It had a post office, a telegraph, a general store, a livery, a bank, and a church with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings and on the occasions the town judged important enough to warrant the sound of it. It had a saloon. The Silver Ace took up the center of the main street's west side, 2 stories, painted white once, and now the color of old cream, with a front porch wide enough to seat 8 men, and a sign above the door with Denton Hale's name on it, because Denton Hale had made sure his name was above everything in Calder's Bluff that mattered. The saloon, the freighting company on the south edge of town, a 60% interest in the grain mill, and the sheriff. Not the sheriff's salary, the sheriff himself. Sheriff Ira Pruitt had been wearing the badge in Calder's Bluff for 11 years, which sounds like a long time until you learn that Denton Hale had owned the Silver Ace for 12. Pruitt was a large man with a large mustache and the particular posture of a man who had once been something and now was something else, and had spent a long time making peace with the distance between the two. He wore the badge. He kept the peace when keeping it cost nothing. When it cost something, he looked the other way, and Denton Hale paid for the looking. That is the town Clara Voss had been trying to survive in for 5 months. Her husband, Thomas Voss, had died in April, 3 weeks after signing his name to a loan note from Hale's lending operation at the Silver Ace. Thomas had borrowed $400 to cover the seed cost for his second planting season. The terms, as written on the note in the hand of Hale's clerk, required repayment of $580 by the first day of October, with a penalty clause that transferred title of the Voss property, 40 acres on the north side of the valley with the best water access in the county, if payment was not made in full by that date. Thomas Voss died of a fever before May was out. He had been 29 years old. Clara was 26. She had a milk cow, a mule, a kitchen garden, and a loan note in her dead husband's name that she had not been party to signing and had not known the terms of until Hale's clerk arrived at her door 7 days after Thomas was in the ground and read them to her in the flat. Patient voice of a man who has delivered bad news so many times, it no longer registers as bad. She did not cry in front of the clerk. She thanked him for coming and closed the door, and then sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then she got up and went to the barn and fed the mule. That was the kind of woman Clara Voss was. Over the 5 months between Thomas's death and that Wednesday in October, she had done everything a woman in her position could reasonably do, and some things that went considerably beyond reasonable. She had hired herself out as a laundress to 4 families in town to generate cash. She had sold the milk cow and 2 of the 3 pigs Thomas had been keeping for winter. She had written letters to Thomas's brother in Kansas asking for a loan and received a reply that expressed condolences and contained no money. She had gone to the one lawyer in Calder's Bluff, a man named Elroy who had an office above the general store. Elroy had looked at the loan note and looked at her and looked at the window and concluded that the note appeared to have been legally executed, and he was not certain what options she had. She noticed he did not look at her while he said it. She added Elroy to the list in the small notebook she had started keeping in June, the one she wrote in at the kitchen table each night by the lamp. Not a diary, a record. Every visit from Hale's men, every threat, every dollar amount, and every name, written in small, careful letters, every entry dated, every detail preserved. Clara Voss had concluded early that if she was going to survive what Denton Hale was doing to her, the most durable tool available to her was the truth written down in the most complete form she could manage. So she wrote it down, every word of it. By September she had gotten $400 together, 400 of the 580. She was $80 short. Hale's clerk came to the property on the 3rd of October. Clara gave him what she had. 30 more days, she asked, for the balance. The clerk wrote out a receipt, tucked the $400 into his coat, and gave her a date, the 15th. The 15th came. She had $57 more, not the remaining 80. She went to Hale directly. She stood in the Silver Ace in the morning when it was quiet and placed what she had on the counter and asked for 2 more weeks. The other men in the room that morning watched this exchange with the careful sideways attention of men who have learned that watching Denton Hale conduct business is useful information for a person's future. Hale was a man of 51 years, gray at the temples, well-dressed in the way of a man who considers his clothing a form of argument. He had a face that would have been pleasant if it were not for his eyes, which had the flat assessing quality of a man who looks at everyone in front of him and sees only the calculation of what that person is worth and what it will cost to extract it. He listened to Clara. He looked at the $57 on the counter between them. Default as of the 15th, he said. The property was his. She could vacate by the following Wednesday, or his men would come and assist her in doing so. Her chin came up. I have paid $457 on a $580 note, and I want that in writing. Hale looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but existed in the uncomfortable space between them. In writing, yes, when she signed the transfer deed. That was a Monday. The quiet man rode into Calder's Bluff on Tuesday evening. He came in from the south, the direction of the Pecos country, on a roan horse that moved with the patient economy of an animal that has covered long distances enough times that it has stopped worrying about the next one. The man himself looked like no particular kind of man, which was its own kind of distinction. 44, maybe 45, with the weathered look of someone who has spent most of his years outdoors, and none of them soft. Gray coat, no decoration, hat pulled enough that his eyes required some attention to find. He came into town without announcement and without anyone noticing him, which was the way he always came into towns, because a man who has spent as many years in as many places as this man had learned that arriving noticed is a choice, and he had developed a strong preference for the alternative. He rode to the livery at the south end of Main Street and arranged stabling for the roan with the teenage boy working there, a boy who barely looked up from the horse he was brushing. And then he walked north, up the main street in the early evening light, and looked at Calder's Bluff with the specific patient attentiveness of a man who is reading a town the way other men read books, not for story, but for the information that tells you how to move inside it. He had read perhaps a dozen towns this way. The reading always told him the same things, if you knew what to look for. Which men moved with borrowed confidence, where the actual authority in a place resided, whether the badge on the sheriff's chest corresponded to anything behind his eyes. He read Calder's Bluff in about 4 blocks, and went into the Silver Ace and chose the corner table by the window and ordered a whiskey, and sat down. He had no particular business in Calder's Bluff. He was passing through on his way west, and had stopped because the roan needed rest and he was not opposed to a night indoors, if the indoors was quiet. He expected Calder's Bluff to be quiet. He was on his second whiskey when Clara Voss came through the door with Hale's men holding her arms. She had been at her property, going through Thomas's papers one more time, when 3 men arrived. 2 of them she recognized from previous visits. Cruz, who was broad and quiet. Nate, who was narrow and not quiet, and who seemed to enjoy these sorts of errands in a way that sat wrong in the chest to look at. The third was a man named Fitch, she had seen around the Silver Ace. A man with the particular face of someone who does exactly what he is told, and has arranged his conscience to accommodate whatever that turns out to be. Hale wanted her to come sign the deed transfer, they said. She had not agreed to any deed transfer, she answered. Nate took hold of her left arm. Cruz took hold of her right. Fitch opened the door. They put her in a wagon and drove her down the main street in full daylight, in front of whatever Calder's Bluff felt like having eyes that morning, and nobody on that street said anything. Because Calder's Bluff had been learning for 12 years that the cost of saying something where Denton Hale's business was concerned was a cost most people could not afford. The deed transfer was on a table in the saloon when they brought her in. Hale was standing beside it, and his clerk and Sheriff Pruitt, who stood near the bar with his arms crossed, and the deliberate expression of a man performing impartiality for a room that knows better. They pulled her across the floor in front of every man in the room, and she did not make a sound, because making a sound would have meant surrendering something she was not prepared to surrender. And Clara Voss had given up enough already. Hale indicated the deed. Already written, he said. She just needed to sign it, and then they would be square and she could go on with her life. She looked at the deed on the table. She looked at Hale. I am not going to sign it. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something that has been building for a long time arrives at its turning point. The 20-odd men in the Silver Ace that morning were all looking at Clara and at Hale and at the deed paper, and not one of them was looking at the corner table. Nate's hand came up. It came down across Clara's face with the flat sound that a struck person makes in a room that has decided to be silent about it. She went to the floor, one hand catching herself on the boards, dark hair falling across her face. The room stayed silent. Somewhere in the room, someone laughed. Not a large laugh. The quiet, embarrassed kind that a man produces when he does not want to appear out of step with the men around him. Then, another. Then the particular collective murmur of men who are relieved that the situation has a direction they can follow without having to choose one themselves. The glass in the corner came down onto the table without sound. The chair moved back. The man in the gray coat was already on his feet. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room that has gone quiet for the wrong reasons, a voice at a single controlled volume carries to every corner without any additional effort. He said the one word that the situation required. Enough. Every head in the Silver Ace turned toward the corner table for the first time since the man in the gray coat had sat down. Nate looked at him. Cruz looked at him. Hale looked at him. Then at Sheriff Pruitt, and Pruitt looked at the corner table with the expression of a man calculating distances and deciding they are workable. Nate let go of Clara's arm and walked 3 steps toward the corner table. He was the kind of man who did this work because he was large, and because large had always worked for him, and he had not yet in his life encountered a room in which large was insufficient. Sit back down. The quiet man looked at him, not the way men look at threats. The way a man looks at something he has already finished assessing and has moved on from mentally. I'll ask you once to step back. That's the one time I'll ask." Nate did not step back. What happened next happened fast enough that the room had difficulty afterward accounting for its order. What the men in the Silver Ace agreed on was this: Nate did not reach the corner table. What happened to Nate was efficient, and not particularly dramatic, and left Nate seated on the floor beside the bar, with the expression of a man who has received completely new information about the nature of the situation he was in. Cruz moved next, either out of loyalty or the particular human difficulty of changing direction when you are already moving. And the result for Cruz was similar. Fitch looked at the corner table. Then he looked at the door. Fitch was the kind of man whose survival instincts ran considerably sharper than his loyalty, and those instincts told him that the door was the correct direction. He went through it. The room was quiet for a long time after. Hale stood beside the deed table. Sheriff Pruitt stood by the bar. Neither of them had moved. The man in the gray coat walked past Nate and Cruz to where Clara Voss was still on the floor and offered her his hand. She looked at it for a moment, the look of a woman assessing the intention behind an offered hand, and then took it and stood. She pushed the hair from her face and looked at the man beside her. "Who are you?" He looked at her. He looked at Pruitt. Then he said the thing that made the Silver Ace go quieter than it had been even a moment before, quieter even than when Nate's hand had come down across Clara's face. He said Denton Hale's name the way a man says a name when he has been carrying it for a while, and has been waiting to find the right room to set it down in. Then, plainly, "I believe this woman has been making payments on a legal debt note. I'd like to see that note." Pruitt took 2 steps away from the bar. His hand moved to the general vicinity of his gun in the specific manner of a man reminding everyone in the room that the gun exists. "Private business between Mr. Hale and the widow," Pruitt said. Nothing more. The quiet man looked at the badge on Pruitt's chest, with the particular attentiveness of a man reading a word that does not match the sentence around it. "A badge is a promise, Sheriff. You might want to think about whether you're keeping it." Pruitt's face did the thing that faces do when something true arrives at them in public. He looked at Hale instead. Hale was looking at the quiet man with the specific expression of a man who has spent 12 years being the most powerful presence in every room he entered, and is encountering for the first time the sensation of not being sure. "That is still true. My name is Denton Hale." His voice carried the room easily. "I own this establishment, and you are interfering with a legal proceeding. I know who you are." The quiet man looked at Hale for a moment. "I've known for about 7 years." Something moved behind Hale's eyes. Something small and fast, like a thing startled by its own exposure. The quiet man did not explain what he meant. He put his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder, the way a man touches a thing to indicate that he intends to stay beside it, and said, "We're going to walk out of here now. The deed is going to stay on that table, unsigned. And you and I, Mr. Hale, are going to have a different kind of conversation before long." He walked Clara Voss out of the Silver Ace into the Calder's Bluff morning, and none of the 20 men in the room moved to stop them. Now, before we go any further into what happened, I want to stop here for a moment, because I think about that walk out of the Silver Ace a great deal. I think about what it meant for a woman who had been on the floor of that room 30 seconds before to walk out of it upright. I want you to hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. What time is it where you are? Are you at home? On a drive? Somewhere quiet? I want to know. And while you're down there, tell me something else. Has anyone ever stood up for you in a room where everyone else looked away? Just yes or no. That's all. I read every comment. Every last one. Now, let's go back to Calder's Bluff and to the man in the gray coat, because you need to know who he was. And that requires going back a good deal further than that Wednesday morning. His name, the one he had been born with, was not the name men knew him by. He had been born Fletcher Cade in Texas in 1843. The youngest of 3 boys on a cattle spread in the hill country, that had been good land when his father worked it, and indifferent land after he was gone, which was what land often became when the man who understood it was no longer there to read it. Fletcher Cade had left Texas at 17, with $40 and a horse and the particular forward-looking focus of a young man who has decided that the place he is from is not the place he intends to remain. He had ridden west, and then south, and then west again over the next several years in the pattern that a young man makes when he is learning the territory of himself. And during those years he had become, through a combination of circumstances, an inclination and the specific demands of life in the territory in those decades, very good at a thing that he had not particularly sought to become good at. He was fast. Not flash fast in the way that young men performing their speed were fast. He was the other kind. The kind that takes the time to already be finished when the other man is still deciding to start. He had learned this difference through a sequence of situations early enough in his life that it had become the way he did things generally, not just the thing he pointed at a man on the other side of a street. The men who wrote about him in newspapers got it wrong in the ways newspapers always got it wrong. They wrote about the speed and the dramatic names of the places where things had happened. What they did not write about, because it made less compelling reading, was the patience. The specific patience of a man who will sit in a corner table in an unfamiliar saloon for 40 minutes, watching a town through a window before anything has happened, because he has learned that the 40 minutes of watching is what everything afterward depends on. He had been called the gray ghost in some places, on account of the coat and the way he could be in a room without anyone knowing he was in it until the moment he chose to be known. He did not use any of these names himself. He used his given name, Fletcher Cade, when names were required, and on the several occasions when men from his past had recognized him in places he had not expected to be recognized. He had found the experience inconvenient in the ways that recognition of that particular kind tends to be. He had known Denton Hale's name for 7 years, because 7 years before, in a town in Arizona Territory, 3 men working for Hale had killed a man named Amos Reyes. Amos Reyes had been a freight hauler in Arizona Territory, a large, cheerful man of Mexican descent, with a wife and 4 children in the town of Nogales, and a freight route that ran north through 3 counties. He had been one of a handful of men over the 20-odd years of Fletcher Cade's adult life, who had treated Cade with the specific, uncomplicated decency of a person who does not make a calculation before deciding how to act toward another person. Amos Reyes had been killed because he had seen something on his freight route that one of Hale's operations in Arizona needed not to have been seen. The 3 men who did it were never charged. Hale had been in New Mexico by the time anyone connected the threads. Cade had been in Colorado. He had spent 6 months afterward finding the 3 men who did the actual work. That part of the story is not strictly relevant here, except to say that it had been accomplished, and that the man who had done it had been thinking, in a low background way that did not prevent him from living his life, but also did not entirely leave him, about Denton Hale for 7 years since. He had not been looking for Hale when he rode into Calder's Bluff. That was the particular thing about that Tuesday evening. He had stopped for the roan. He had noticed the name above the Silver Ace's freighting operation on the south edge of town as he came in, a name he recognized, though he had not expected to see it in New Mexico. And then he had gone to the saloon and sat in the corner and watched the town through the window, and thought about what the presence of that name in this particular valley meant for the people living in it. He had been thinking about Clara Voss for 11 minutes. When she came through the door, he walked with her east out of town to her property. She did not speak much on the walk. She was the kind of person who needed quiet after something like what had just happened, not to recover so much as to reassess, to take the new information and recalculate where it put her. He understood this kind of quiet and did not fill it with anything she had not asked for. At the property she made coffee and set it on the table and sat across from him and looked at him with the level directness of a woman who has been managing something alone for 5 months and has developed a low tolerance for evasion. "I'm listening," she said. His name was Fletcher Cade. He had known Denton Hale's name from years before and left it there, because the rest of that story was not what she needed at the moment. She looked at him for a while. Then she got up and came back with the notebook. She set it on the table between them. A record, she said. Every visit from Hale's men. Every amount. Every name. Everything since Thomas died. In order. With dates. He picked it up and read it from the beginning without speaking. He read it the way he read things that mattered completely and without rushing, giving every page the same attention as the one before it. It took a while. When he finished, he set the notebook down and looked at the table for a moment. The notebook was the most complete private record of systematic corruption and intimidation that he had seen in a very long time. Clara Voss had written it with the specific care of a person who understands that documentation is the most durable form of resistance available to someone without money or legal standing. Every claim Hale had ever made was in there with the date it was made and the man who made it. Every dollar she had paid was in there with the receipt she had kept. Elroy, the lawyer, appeared twice, and both entries were damning. This is remarkable work. Her hands were around her coffee cup. Thomas would have done more. He was better with words than me. What you did with words is sufficient. After a moment he laid out what he knew about Hale from before. Not everything. The relevant part. Hale had operated in Arizona Territory before New Mexico. There was a history of violence in connection with his operations that went further back than Calder's Bluff, and considerably further back than the loan on Thomas Voss's land. The man was not simply a crooked businessman in one county. The notebook she had kept was potentially evidence of something larger than she knew. She was quiet for a long time after. What do you intend to do? A straightforward question, in the voice of a woman who had earned the right to ask it directly. A couple of days he needed to look at the situation from the outside. She was not to go back into town alone before then. Fitch had gone somewhere when he left the saloon. And wherever Fitch had gone, Hale knew by now that something had happened in the Silver Ace that Hale had not planned on. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been living with danger long enough that new information about it does not panic her, but simply gets added to the accounting. He slept in the barn that night. The roan was content with the company of the mule, and horses that are content tend to sleep well, and horses that sleep well keep better watch than most men do. In the morning he rode a full circuit of Clara's 40 acres before the light was fully up. He was the kind of man who walked ground that might need defending before any defending became necessary, because the time to understand the geography of a piece of land is not when 10 men are coming across it toward you. He noted the water access on the north side where a creek came through at the base of the ridge. He noted the barn's elevation relative to the approach road. He noted the 3 places on the property where a man in a good position could see the road while being essentially invisible from it. Then he rode into Calder's Bluff. He went to the telegraph office first. He sent a message to a federal marshal named Dyer who operated out of Santa Fe, a man he had dealt with twice before, the kind of law officer who used a badge to mean something. 3 sentences, the name of the town, the name Denton Hale, and a description of what the notebook contained. Documentation to follow by the next day. Then he went to find Elroy. The lawyer's office above the general store smelled of old paper, and the particular anxiety of a man who has been making small moral compromises for a long time, and has learned to live with the smell of them. Elroy was a thin man with the appearance of someone who has been dried out by years of doing nothing that required him to stand up straight. Cade put the notebook on Elroy's desk and turned it to the 2 entries with Elroy's own name in them. Elroy read them. His face did not move much while he was reading, which was the face of a man who already knows what he is going to find, and is deciding how to respond to finding it in writing. I simply advised Mrs. Voss of the legal situation. Cade looked at him steadily. The notebook had described 2 separate visits in which the legal advice provided had been precisely what benefited Hale's position and precisely what was least useful to Clara Voss. And if a federal marshal from Santa Fe were to read those entries, Elroy's capacity to continue practicing law in New Mexico Territory would become a matter of some uncertainty. Elroy was quiet for a long while. What he needed was a legal review of the original loan note, done that day, in writing, signed. Elroy looked at the notebook. He looked at the wall. He looked at the window in the particular way a man looks at a window when he is trying to decide which side of a lion he can still afford to stand on. He would look at the note. Cade left the notebook with him and went to find the general store's owner, a man named Whitfield, who Clara's notebook described as having witnessed the signing of the original loan document, present in the Silver Ace on the day Thomas Voss had come in to collect his money and had been steered by Hale's clerk into the side office where the note was prepared. Whitfield had not been called as a witness to anything. He was simply a man who had been there and seen the terms of the note read to Thomas Voss, and seen the expression on Thomas's face when the penalty clause was explained. Whitfield was a compact man of 60, with the particular watchfulness of someone who has spent years in a town like this learning to be useful without being visible. He heard Cade out. He looked at the counter between them for a long time. "If I tell what I know, Hale finds out. Probably true," Cade agreed. "And you think that's worth the risk?" The risk was already there. That was the point. The difference between a town in which men like Hale operated without consequence and a town in which they didn't was not the absence of risk. It was whether the risk was shared or carried alone, the way Clara Voss had been carrying it for 5 months. Whitfield looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who has decided something he knew he was going to decide all along, and was simply waiting for the right moment to admit it to himself. He would write down what he saw the day Thomas Voss signed the note. That afternoon, Cade returned to Elroy and took the written review of the loan note, establishing, in the specific careful language of a man covering the distance he had left himself between his conscience and his actions, that the penalty clause as written was inconsistent with territorial lending law, and that the $457 Clara Voss had paid constituted payment of the principal in full, with the remainder constituting what the law would likely characterize as excessive interest on an illegal penalty provision. That evening, Cade rode back to Clara's property with 3 documents in his coat: Elroy's review, Whitfield's statement, and the notebook itself. He laid them out on the kitchen table and walked her through what each of them meant, one at a time, in order. She read them in order. She was quiet for a long while after. "Is this enough?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear what was under it. 5 months of carrying something alone, finally finding a place to set some of it down. Enough for Santa Fe, yes. Whether it was enough for what Hale was going to do in the next 48 hours was a different question. How many men do you think he'll send? Cade had been thinking about this since he walked the property that morning. Between 8 and 12, probably. Enough to ensure there was no possibility of a repeat of what had happened in the saloon. Clara stood up and went to the back room. She came back with a Winchester rifle and a box of shells and set them on the table. "Thomas bought me this the first winter." She ran her thumb along the stock. "He said every woman on the frontier should know how to use a rifle. He spent 3 Saturdays teaching me." Cade looked at the rifle. He looked at Clara. The barn roof. She could hold a position there if it came to that. "Tell me what position." He spent the next hour walking her through the property the way he had walked it himself that morning. The barn roof gave the clearest sightline on the approach road and the yard below. If men came in numbers, the thing numbers depended on was sight lines. What you did about numbers was control what they could see. She listened the way she read her notebook, completely and without losing the thread. After, they sat on the porch until the dark came up over the ridge and the lights in the valley below went out. One by one, the night was cold with the specific high country cold of October in New Mexico, the kind that settles in the chest and stays there. "How did you come to know Denton Hale?" He told her about Amos Reyes, not quickly, the way a man tells a thing that matters to him, with the time it deserves, and she listened to it the same way. When he was done, she sat for a long while without speaking. Then, "You've been carrying that for 7 years?" He supposed he had. She looked out at the dark valley. Do you think about him often? He thought about the freight road where it happened, the specific stretch on a Tuesday morning, the particular light that came through the cottonwoods there in the autumn, very clear and low. Amos had been on his way back to Nogales when it happened. He had been going home. Clara said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, I think about Thomas on his way back from the Silver Ace with the loan. Whether he understood what he'd signed, whether he was worried about it on the way home, or whether he was still hoping it would work out. He didn't know. Neither do I. I try not to wonder, but I do. The night settled around them the way nights settle in high places. Gradually and completely, an owl moved in the cottonwoods by the creek. The mule shifted in the barn. After a long while, whatever comes tomorrow, I want you to know that what you did in that saloon was the first time in 5 months that I felt like the thing I was doing might actually hold. She was the one who had been doing the thing. The notebook was hers. Every payment receipt was hers. He had only said one word and pushed back a chair. That was enough of a word. They went inside before midnight. Hale's men came before dawn. Cade had been awake since 3 o'clock, not because he was worried in the way that keeps a man awake, but because he had learned over many years that the period just before dawn was when men who were going to come came, because they believed the dark gave them advantage and did not sufficiently account for the fact that the people they were coming for had also learned this. The roan heard them first. He moved to the fence line at the south end of the pasture, with his ears forward and his head up at an angle that told Cade the sound was coming from the south road, perhaps 20 minutes out, and that there were enough of them that a single horse in a pasture had decided to take official notice. He went to the barn loft and called up softly. Clara was already awake with the Winchester across her knees in the way of a woman who had also known this might be when they came. 15 minutes. Maybe less. She descended from the loft in the dark without difficulty. She went to the water bucket and washed her face in the cold water and pushed her hair back. She took the ammunition box from the shelf and put it in her coat pocket and climbed back up to the roof access on the barn's south wall. He watched her go. The specific, composed efficiency of a woman who had decided 5 months ago that she was not going to be moved from this land and had not changed her mind about it since. He went to the east fence line. He had chosen 3 positions on the east fence the previous morning during his walk of the property. Position 1 was at the corner where the fence met the approach road gate, invisible from the road itself, because of the angle which gave a clear view of whoever came through the gate without being in their direct sightline. Position 2 was 40 yards north along the fence, where a stand of juniper gave natural cover and a shot angle on the yard that no one coming through the gate would think to account for. Position 3 was behind a water trough, at the east side of the barn, the lowest position and the closest to the house if it came to that. He went to position 1 and waited. They came in through the south road in the first gray of morning before the light was fully up, and there were 11 of them, which was the number Hale had decided was sufficient. Nate was not among them. Nate had gone home with a different sense of the situation than he had arrived with, which Cade had anticipated. Cruz was there, which meant Cruz's loyalty was of the variety that repaired itself overnight. Fitch was there, and at the front, which surprised Cade slightly, was Denton Hale himself. Hale was on a black horse, well dressed even at this hour, in the specific way of a man who considers his clothing an argument he maintains regardless of audience. He rode through the gate and into the yard and pulled up in the middle and called for Clara. He called twice. On the second call, Cade stepped out from the east fence angle into the yard. The 11 men looked at him. They looked at the east fence and the gate they had ridden through, without looking at the specific angle beside it, where this man had been standing. The arithmetic of what that meant arrived in the faces of the more experienced men among them with the speed of calculation. Hale looked at him across the yard. Something moved behind Hale's eyes again. The same thing that had moved there in the Silver Ace. The specific private recognition of a man who has arrived at a situation he did not fully prepare for. Cade said his name. He said it the way he had said it in the saloon, the way you say a thing you have been carrying and are now setting down in the appropriate place. Amos Reyes was going home to his children. The yard was quiet for the length of time it took for those words to arrive at the men who heard them, and for the men who knew what they meant, to understand what they meant. Hale said nothing. Cade kept his voice level. You have a ledger in Santa Fe by now, Mr. Hale. A federal marshal received a full accounting of this property yesterday. The loan note that Clara Voss's husband signed has been reviewed by territorial law, and the principal is paid in full. There's also a written statement from a witness who was present when Thomas Voss signed the note and heard the penalty clause explained. He paused. The yard had the quality of a space holding its breath. Ride out, all of you. Leave the deed unsigned. I'll give you until noon to make that decision. After noon, Marshal Dyer makes his. Hale looked at him from the black horse. He had the expression of a man performing a calculation that keeps coming out the same wrong answer. He had brought 11 men to a property in the dark before dawn, to move a woman who would not move, and instead he had found a man standing at the east fence angle who knew his name from 7 years back, and had apparently spent the previous day building a documentation trail that connected Calder's Bluff to Arizona territory. Crews moved first, either loyalty or the specific human difficulty of accepting a situation that has changed while you were riding toward it. He was 10 yards from the east fence when the crack of Clara's Winchester from the barn roof put a shot in the dirt, 2 feet in front of his horse, close enough that the horse reared and Cruz went sideways in the saddle. He did not fall, but he stopped. The 11 men looked at the barn roof. Then they looked at each other with the expression of men who were rerunning the previous 20 seconds through the filter of new information. 2 of them turned their horses without a word, not running. The deliberate, controlled departure of men who have made a professional assessment of the available options and have chosen the one that does not require them to continue being in this yard. 3 more followed shortly after. Fitch, for the second time in 2 days, made the survival calculation faster than his colleagues. That left 4 men and Hale. Cade took 2 steps toward Hale's horse. He stopped at a distance close enough to be clearly heard and far enough that nothing required to happen yet would happen until after the words were said. 4 men still in this yard meant 4 men who could be questioned in Santa Fe about what they were riding here to do before sunrise. 4 men whose names he would give to Marshal Dyer, along with everything else. Or 4 men who could ride back to town right now and let the federal process conclude without anyone needing to account for being here at dawn. He looked at the 4 men, one at a time, long enough that each of them had the opportunity to understand that their name was going to be in the accounting either way, and the question was only whether it was in connection with riding away or with staying. 3 of them rode. The 4th looked at Hale, and then at the empty space where 8 of his colleagues had been a minute ago, and made his choice. Hale sat on the black horse alone. The morning light was up by then, the good clean light of an October morning in the territory, the kind that makes every object it falls on appear to be exactly and completely itself. Cade looked at him. He said the thing that needed saying, and the way he said it left no room for the kind of answer a man like Hale usually gave, because it was not a question and not a threat. It was an accounting, plain and complete. This is what existed. This is what it was worth. And this is what now needed to happen in the order it needed to happen. Hale's expression did the thing that expressions do when a man realizes that the ground he built 12 years on has shifted under him in 48 hours. The particular certainty that he had been the most dangerous presence in every room for those 12 years no longer accounted for the room he was in. He looked at the barn roof where Clara Voss had lowered the Winchester and was watching him from above. He looked at the east fence. He looked at the house where the ledger notebook sat on the kitchen table, going nowhere. He rode out the gate without speaking. Clara came down from the barn roof and stood in the yard in the morning light. Her coat was covered in dust from the barn roof, and her hair was not where it had been that morning, and she was holding the Winchester in one hand with the barrel pointed at the ground, and her other hand was loose at her side. Is it done? Not done yet. the law had to conclude. Dyer's people would come from Santa Fe, and it would go through the process it needed to go through, and that process would take weeks. But the weight of it, the specific daily weight of it that she had been carrying alone, that part was done. She did not say anything for a long while. "I want to go inside and make coffee." That sounded right. Marshal Dreyer arrived from Santa Fe 4 days later with 2 deputies and a federal warrant. He was a plain-spoken man of 52, who had been doing this particular kind of work long enough that the complexity of a situation did not intimidate him so much as interest him, the way a skilled craftsman looks at a complicated problem with professional attention rather than alarm. He read the notebook at Clara's kitchen table with the same completeness that Cade had read it. He read Elroy's written review of the loan note and Whitfield's statement. He had received the full accounting Cade had sent from the telegraph office, and had been, 7 months now, building a federal case around Denton Hale's operations in the territory on an unrelated matter out of Tucson. What he had now was not a different case, but the completion of the case he already had. He set the notebook down and looked at Clara across the table. "I have been looking for the thread that tied the Arizona piece to the New Mexico piece for 7 months. A pause. This is the thread. Denton Hale was taken into federal custody on the afternoon of the same day Dyer arrived. Removed from the Silver Ace in the presence of half of Calder's Bluff's Main Street population, who watched from the sidewalks with the specific silent attentiveness of people who have been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen, and are being careful not to say anything until they are certain it has happened. Sheriff Pruitt was relieved of his badge that same afternoon by federal order. He surrendered it, without much apparent protest, with the specific, resigned compliance of a man who has known for a long time that there was a version of events in which this was always going to be the conclusion. The loan note on Thomas Voss's land was voided by territorial court order 11 days later. The 40 acres reverted to Clara's name free and clear. Elroy, who had produced the legal review, was not charged. What happened with his law practice after is its own story and belongs to the particular justice that a small town delivers in its own slow way to men who spent years looking out windows when they should have been looking at the people asking them for help. Whitfield kept his store. Clara sat at her kitchen table with the court order in her hands for a long while after the deputy who delivered it had ridden back toward town. The paper was clean and official and bore the seal of the territorial court and said in its careful legal language that the property at the north end of the valley with the creek access was hers, unencumbered, and had been hers all along. She folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the notebook. Then she went out and fed the mule. Cade left on a Thursday morning. He was a man who had learned over years that leaving before the day gets organized around your presence is easier for everyone. And he had spent enough of his life in places where he was not the one who should stay to understand the difference. He saddled the roan in the gray light before Clara was awake, and rode south along the property line one last time, past the creek on the north side where the morning light was coming in low and very clear, the specific clean light of an October morning in New Mexico. And he thought about Amos Reyes on a freight road in Arizona, with cottonwoods on either side and the sun coming through them at this angle. He thought it was a good kind of morning for a man who had been carrying something to feel a little lighter. He was 2 miles south of Clara's property when he heard hooves behind him. He did not hurry the roan or slow it. He rode at the same pace and waited. Clara came up alongside him on the mule. She was wearing her coat, and her hair was up, and she did not look like someone who had woken up recently so much as someone who had been awake for the same amount of time he had, and had simply been waiting in the house until the appropriate moment. She rode beside him for a while without saying anything. You left without saying anything. He had not known what to say. She was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have liked you. He was the kind of man who appreciated people who did things without making a speech about it first. Thomas sounded like a good man, Cade said. He was. Her voice was steady and plain. He was the kind of man who believed the right thing was the right thing, even when it was inconvenient, and even when nobody was watching. I missed that kind of courage before I met it in you. She had plenty of it herself. They rode side by side for another half-mile without speaking. The morning was good and cold, and the valley was full of it. The kind of October air that is clean in the chest and clear on the tongue, and makes the world seem like it might be manageable after all. At the south bend in the road where the Calder's Bluff route met the Pecos road heading west, he pulled the roan up. Clara stopped the mule. She looked at him. "I expect you to not get killed out there, Mr. Cade." "Doing his best," he said. "Do better." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that a man who has not smiled in a very long time produces, and it arrived and then was gone. But it had been there. Take care of the 40 acres. That, she said, is not the sort of thing that requires instruction. He nodded. He turned the roan west. He did not look back, which was the way he left places, and the roan carried him down the Pecos road, into the morning light in the specific unhurried way of an animal that knows it is heading somewhere, and has decided that somewhere is the right direction. Clara sat on the mule at the bend in the road and watched him go. Then she turned the mule north and rode back to the property and fed the chickens and filled the water barrel from the creek, and went inside and made coffee and sat at the table with it and looked at the drawer where the quart. Order was folded beside the notebook. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and underneath it she wrote a single sentence. "It is paid. Now, I have been carrying this story for a long time, partner, and I want to say something about it before we part ways tonight, because I think it matters. We talk a great deal about courage in this life, as if it were a single thing, a moment, a gun drawn fast in a saloon, and sometimes it is that. Sometimes courage is exactly one word said at the right volume, in the right room at the right instant. But more often than not, courage is a notebook. It is the small, careful letters written at a kitchen table after every visit from every man who came to tell you that you were beaten, written not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was going to read them, not because you knew for certain they would ever matter, but because the truth deserved to exist, somewhere permanent, even if the person writing it could not be certain of what permanent meant. Clara Voss wrote down what was true for 5 months alone, and because she wrote it down, a federal marshal had a thread. Because she wrote it down, 40 acres stayed where they belonged. Because she wrote it down, the children in this county grew up in a place where Denton Hale was no longer the name above the bank door. You do not need to be the man in the gray coat to do something that matters. You need to be the person at the kitchen table at the end of a long day who decides that the truth is worth one more entry. The rest of it follows from that. If this story found you tonight, partner, wherever you are, I hope you'll stay with us. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories where this one came from, and every last one of them is about the kind of ordinary courage that makes the extraordinary kind possible. Until our trails cross again, keep your powder dry and your soul honest. We'll see you on the trail.